Okay. Um, Again, subjective notions, adequate, minimal, basic. What is needed in the present age always comes down to a human interpretation. There's no, we can't avoid that. There's no goals, ends. I think I made this point earlier in the course. There are no such things as goals, ends, aims of education in general and set for all time. It's always dependent upon context. Ends, aims, purposes of education are formed formed or developed in direct response to the particular problems that individuals share together in a particular time. The interpretation of what those problems are, the sources of those problems, and how to resolve them, of course, is a matter of human interpretation and debate. We struggle over these things, as we've seen. Well, the Supreme Court case was sent back to the state of Texas. They argue that this remedy does not require judicial intrusion, as they put it. It's not a judicial remedy. It should go back to the state legislators, and it did go back to the state of Texas, and the state of Texas did pass legislation that attempted to address this issue, and fairly effectively, from what I understand. Now, I'm not an expert in school finance, and you'd have to go to educational administrators and people, hire people from higher ed policy, and who have spent time with this issue to know the long term effects and the particulars. But every state, this had implications for other states. From California, New Jersey, Rhode Island, the areas in the South, most states, other than Texas, most states did absolutely nothing to address the issues of equality and inequality and inequity in public schooling. Whether that is that they didn't do absolutely nothing. They blocked it, basically. Various state legislatures blocked it, or, for instance, whether that be gerrymandering, what do you call it when you filibustering, just standing up and talking endlessly until we just say, you know what, to hell with it, let's go home. Or I'll give you an example. The state of California. Wrote legislation that everyone could pretty much agree upon that would provide financial equity and experiential equality to students. But some legislators insisted that attach riders to such legislation for special projects and so forth. Sure, we'll give you equitable funding for schools if you support my gazillion-dollar project here in my local community. And so the riders attached to such legislation was so outrageous that no one could support the overall piece of legislation at all, and so they just let it die. So really, from 1973 to the really 1989 Rose case, nothing happened. We attempted to deal with, as states and as a people in general across the country, we attempted to deal with this issue of adequate, minimal education, adequate education fit for our time. But the Rose case in Kentucky is one of the first set off in 1989, set off a series of court cases that attempted to address this issue of adequacy and minimal education for full participation in a democratic society. And most states had most states did, every state has some provision for education in its constitution or on its books, so to speak. But often they had nebulous terms such as adequate, or not nebulous, but abstract terms such as adequate. In the case of Kentucky, they had efficient education. And so what they did to try to make that more, and every state did this just about, to make that more concrete, was that they supplanted efficient with another abstraction, sufficient. Anyway, I'll read. The goals. There are seven the 7 goals for the state of Kentucky overall for the state primary and secondary education. When I say primary and secondary, I mean elementary and junior and high schools. And see if these are worthy goals. Now, granted, sufficient still leads us to the problem as adequate oral written communication skills. So, for instance, I'll read the 7, and again, they use the word, they erase efficient and supplant it with sufficient. Sufficient oral and written communication skills to enable students to function in a complex, rapidly changing civilization. Sufficient knowledge of economic, social, and political systems to enable the student to make informed choices. 3. Sufficient understanding of governmental processes to enable the student to understand the issues that affect his or her community, state, and nation. 4. Sufficient self-knowledge and knowledge of his or her mental and physical wellness. 5. Sufficient grounding in the arts to enable each student to appreciate his or her cultural and historical heritage. 6. Sufficient training or preparation for advanced training in either academic or vocational fields so as to enable each child to choose and pursue life work intelligently. And 7. Sufficient levels of academic vocational skills to enable public school students to compete favorably with their counterparts in surrounding states in academics and the job market. Now, if you ask me, I think those 7 goals are worthy goals. I mean, I don't think I could think of anything else. I mean, it covers the gamut from physical, mental wellness to arts to vocational academic fields. Communicative goals. Those are worthy goals. The issue then became the word, how do we know? How do we know if we're meeting these? Sufficient. How do you measure sufficiency? Adequacy. Minimal. Efficient. Whatever, basic. However word you want to put it. Word you want to use. Sorry. And so they found themselves, most states did it. I mean, almost every state in the Union had dealt with this issue. And in which they, and as a result, they basically used one abstraction in place of a former of an abstraction they already had there. North Carolina, they had the issue of sound basic education. Well, sound basic education is one that will provide the student with at least sufficient ability to read, write, and speak the English language, sufficient knowledge of fundamental mathematics and physical science to enable the student to function in a complex, rapidly changing society, sufficient fundamental knowledge of geography, history, and basic economic and political systems to enable the student to make informed choices with regard to issues that affect the student personally and affect the student's community, state, and nation. Sufficient academic and vocational skills to enable the student to successfully engage in post-secondary education or vocational training. And 4, sufficient academic and vocational skills to enable the student to compete on an equal basis with others in further formal education or gainful employment in contemporary societies. Worthy goals. But what does sufficient or sufficient fundamental mean? Well, how are we going to correct that problem? Every state dealt with that, Florida included. How are we going to correct that problem? Well, what most states did was they passed, they passed quantitative measures, quantitative goal or quantitative measures quantitative instruments, or use quantitative instruments to define those abstractions. That is, we developed then what behavioral goals. How do you know that Hewitt's students have a sufficient understanding of metaphor? Well, students will demonstrate the use of metaphor with 95% sufficiency, 95% proficiency, 92% of the time, or something like that. I don't know. You all know that better than I will. Behavioral standards. Behavioral standards is what I was getting at. Behavioral standards. Such that, and now is this a good thing? We pass behavioral quantitative measures for otherwise relative or abstractions. Some would say, yeah, that this is an improvement because we've become very clear now with the passage of, say, the Sunshine State Standards, which is what it was in this state. We've become very clear as to the standards are now defined in quantitative terms, and we're very clear as to what our targets, what we need to approximate or achieve, and so forth. Well, that's all fine and dandy. We'll become very, very clear as to what teachers need to do. But some argue, unless that's fine. Hewitt's he's on this side of the county, and you're on the other side of the county. You both teach high school English or elementary school. You name your context, and he's very clear what he needs to do. He's just not achieving it as well as you are over on the other side of the county. Well, that's all fine and dandy to be very clear, but unless there are consequences, unless there are teeth, so to speak, in the matter, so as to ensure that Hewitt is meeting those targets, then we're still in the very same boat that we started. We started rowing in, so to speak. We're very clear, but we're still not meeting the objectives. We're still not providing equal quality education, and so that is the context out of which No Child Left Behind becomes a bipartisan solution. Now, there are those of us who argue that No Child Left Behind was a backdoor way by which to privatize an otherwise public function. That's left for a later time. We will talk about that at some point in this class. But and let me just say this one more point about that. There is a case to be made for the idea that No Child Left Behind was a backdoor way by which to privatize the public education, but as you've seen throughout this course, much of education, almost every educational policy passed and practice of education has a variety of interest entailed within it. Back to one of the original premises of the course, various factions wanted to use schools as a means to resolve to meet some particular special interest, and not necessarily serve the public, so to speak. We have various interests in educational policy. We'll support educational policy from a variety of angles on the basis of a variety of interests. So it's not it's not a revelation, I guess, to say that No Child Left Behind has served for-profit private interests. That's for another time. But it's out of that context of providing consequence, teeth, so to speak, to ensure that teachers and schools are providing equal educational opportunity, equal educational experience to students, that No Child Left Behind was born. That is one approach to the problems that Kozol has identified in his text. You will see now Kozol argues that, look, he has in his chapter, I think it's called The Ordering Regime. I think it's chapter 4. I can't remember. I'm turning my head too fast. I'm getting a little dizzy. I got crystal issues. Preparing minds for markets. The Ordering Regime is chapter 3. Kozol points out that while No Child Left Behind doesn't require much additional funding, or didn't provide or set aside much additional funding for equality of education. It just demanded, look, we can provide by demanding higher expectations of teachers and students, setting the goals, setting the standards, and holding students, teachers, everyone involved to meet those standards. Holding them to those standards will ensure equal educational opportunity. It doesn't matter if you're going to school in a broom closet, as Kozol points out here, or if you're going in a plush, context. what matters really teacher expectations, and ensuring that students are meeting these expectations. As Kozol points out in the ordering regime, it didn't pan out that way. What we do know is that students who are failing to make adequate yearly progress, and schools that fail to make adequate yearly progress, consequences kick in. The consequences are receivership, that is, the county and or state taking over the administration of that school, in which typically, if that happens, the administration and teaching corps, at least half of, are gone. Receivership, federal funding is tied to it. Teacher assignment, student placement, administrative assignment, now bonuses or merit pay, so to speak. Half of your teachers in this state, as well as many states, half of their annual evaluation is predicated upon or based upon how well students do on standardized tests. Public, or not recognition, but public recognition, I guess. Help people. I mean, the real estate is marketed by way of how well the schools do, for instance. Public perception, I guess, is a rating or whatever. So there's a lot at stake. So one of the things that we do know that a school that fails to make adequate yearly progress has an incentive to meet adequate yearly progress to avoid those consequences. In turn, what that often entails is what we call teaching to the test. You've heard that, teaching to the test. That is narrowing the student's experience to those subjects that can be considered essentially academic, and those that are considered non-essential academic. And sometimes that, of course, that includes sometimes recess, PE, fine arts, sometimes science and social studies. They're non-essential, and therefore little, if any, time are given to them. And then that which remains is often stripped down to that which we can anticipate showing up on the test. Anything else would be, kind of peripheral and tangential to students maximizing those scores. And so it often becomes a conditioned response situation, a training response on the part of the school and individual teachers in order to avoid those consequences. And so there was a different experience that children have in such schools compared to those that are meeting adequate yearly goals. And one of the things that we do, we know statistically, by experience, anecdotally, you name it, is that what demographic tends to do poorly on such tests. They by and large come from low socioeconomic status, and schools that fail to make adequate progress are typically in materially poor areas. That's not to say that all of them are, that all students who are in low SES fail the test. No, there's some who prevail, but we're talking generality here. Typically, we know that the higher, you heard of the zip code effect. Students in certain zip codes will tend to do better on standardized tests than others. I mean, that has everything. We know why that is. It's linked to socioeconomic class, the resources that one has at one's disposal, human as well as material. If somebody's reading to me at home, if they got time to read to me at home, who I have to go home to, is there going to be a meal at home, and so forth. Those make a material difference in academic success and academic performance. We know that. Nevertheless, I mean, look, while the standards are the same, it's kind of like meritocracy. While we both have equal access to the tree of opportunity, you know that some conditions are such that limit, such as you being 30 miles from the tree of opportunity and I'm 5 feet. Well, we can say we both have equal access, but if you got to walk that 30 miles to get to the tree of opportunity, come on, man. So, but in this case, look, the standards still apply to wealthy schools. I'm just use Winter Park, and Winter Park's fine. I don't, but it's couched in a wealthy district. By and large, I mean there's some kids who go to Winter Park who are poor, and there's some people who go to Winter Park and they're not so poor, but they still don't do so well on the test. But by and large, the issue at Winter Park is not failing to make adequate yearly progress. Standards still apply. But it does. But because they continue to meet academic progress, it doesn't affect the climate context of the school, the practices of the school, such that it then narrows the educational experience of students within that school. Whereas if you take a school such as Evans, a school that I have spent some time in over the course of my tenure here at University of Central Florida. A wonderful school, wonderful people, but it's failed to make adequate yearly progress often. And so the years that I was there, spending time in the school, which is 2004, 2005-ish, the school clamped down. It narrowed the curriculum. It taught to the test, so to speak, scripted teachers to some degree. It affects the climate of the school. So No Child Left Behind. We'll get to this again when we discuss Diane Ravich's text. But Kozol would say, look, No Child Left Behind is a justification for not fixing the problem. Insofar as No Child Left Behind did not provide adequate increased financial equity to schools or funding to improve the educational experience of children, then it did nothing to address the root fundamental cause, which is really poverty, which is really rooted in socioeconomic class. But what it did do is it gave the public the sense that that the government is attempting to do something about the issue, attempting to fix at the federal level, which ricochets or trickles down. Trickles down is not the word, but that affects the state level issue of equal educational experience. In effect, it did not. Some would make the argument, Wayne Awe, AU, would make the argument, it exacerbated the issue. It punishes poor people simply for being poor. It didn't address their poverty, which has an effect or is a determinant, or at least affects or an influencer in their academic performance. It just provided consequences as incentives to do better, which in turn didn't affect their socioeconomic status, the particular socioeconomic circumstances, which in turn affects their performance. But so Kozol would say, policies such as No Child Left Behind serve as justifications, because then the public says, well, the government's taking care of it, and the government says it's working on educational quality. Now, there are two other means. Let me get it this way. Look, there's some people who say, look, come on. They would turn to Kozol and say, look, life is not fair. You've heard it's all relative. The opinion from the Supreme Court is that we can only approximate equality in its most relative sense. We can only be equality in its most relative sense. We can't approximate absolute equality. Life is not fair then. Kozol reports this, and then people have said to him, many people, even those who view themselves as liberals on other issues, tend to grow indignant, even rather agitated, if invited to look closely at these inequalities. Life isn't fair, one parent in Winnetka, Chicago, answered flatly when I pressed the matter. Wealthy children go to summer camp all summer. Poor kids, maybe not at all. Or maybe, if they're lucky, for 2 weeks. Wealthy children have the chance to go to Europe, and they have the access to good libraries, encyclopedias, computers, better doctors, nicer homes. Some of my neighbors send their kids to schools like Exeter and Groton. Is government supposed to equalize these things as well? Again, Americans are very suspicious about that. Kozol's response: but government, of course, does not assign us to our homes, our summer camps, our doctors, or to Exeter. It does assign us to our public schools. Indeed, it forces us to go to them. Unless we have the wealth to pay for private education, we are compelled by law, compulsory attendance laws, to go to public school and to the public school in our own district. Thus, the state, by requiring attendance, but by refusing to require equity, effectively requires inequality. Compulsory inequity perpetuated by state law too frequently condemns our children to unequal lives. Now, it's at that stage that proponents of magnet option and voucher plans become the most vocal. Look, if school attendance laws if school attendance laws is requiring this inequity and an inequality of experience, the quick fix to that: magnet and voucher programs. No, they're a little bit different. Magnet schools, look, quick fix. You offer magnet options and vouchers. Well, what do you know about magnet schools? Magnet schools, especially themed schools. You have them all over Winter Park. Orlando area here. I don't know what Winter Park is. Sometimes they'll house IB programs. They'll have Cambridge programs. Magnet schools will be themed in terms of, help me here. I don't know what Edgewater is. Edgewater is science and engineering. Dr. Phillips Performing Arts, you get the idea. Popka's got its, is a magnet for health, allied health, or something like that. Nursing, I don't know, something like that. You get the idea. They're specially themed schools. The idea, particularly by those who say, well, provide magnet schools, is that it's open. The implication is that it's open to everyone, anyone who wants to come. If you got the wherewithal to make it, to get here and to do it, come on. I mean, it's up to you. However, what we do know about magnet schools, well, there's several things about magnet schools. First, they're often not simply come if you want to. Typically, magnet schools will have certain criteria that have to be met by candidates, whether that be a certain grade point average, a performance perhaps to meet certain standards, certain performance on standardized tests, recommendation. So there are letters written and so forth. So it tends, so the idea, and I'm sorry, y'all, I'm thinking of other things as the idea that it's open to everyone. Here we go. Open to everyone. It's just a matter of choice. Is not true in many cases. There are strings attached, so to speak. So it's not necessarily open to everyone. And what we do know statistically, and this really depends upon geographic area. They tend to be schools within schools. That is, let me back up. The very next year, 1974, the very next year after the Rodriguez case, the Supreme Court heard Bradley versus Milliken. I'm screwing this up because I don't have the details right in front of me, but you can look this up on Google if you just simply put in Milliken case, 1974 from Detroit. The particulars go something like this. though I may screw up some minor detail. Inner city Detroit sues the suburbs, saying that making the claim that suburban flight, capital flight, uh, robbed them of a tax base, resources for education, and thus created unequal education. After investigation, the court agreed that it had and filed for to get some of that money back, and this makes it the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says it is true that capital flight deprived inner city schools or deprived inner city Detroit of financial resources that could go to schools, but that flight was not intentional. It wasn't a policy that had the intention of segregating schools or depriving inner city Detroit of financial equity. It was a matter of choice, of people exercising their democratic choice to live where they want to, and flight to go capital to go where it wanted to. And so as a result, and therefore the suburbs owe, it's unfortunate, but the suburbs owe inner city Detroit nothing. One of the mechanisms by which inner city Detroit was to attract that money, or those resources, and thus back into inner city Detroit, was magnet. The idea of a themed school, especially themed school, magnet schools. They started early. I mean, this old idea. The idea was to draw some of that money back into impoverished areas. So you'll often see magnet schools, Cambridge programs, IB programs, good gracious, especially themed schools in poor areas, in poor schools. For instance, just use Eastside High School in the Gainesville area has I think it's a Cambridge program or IB program. The idea was to draw money, particularly money, but also, for lack of a better word, white people. They got the money back into insofar as, if you're looking at percentages of population, I guess that's what I mean. I know that's what I mean, but back into the school. But if you look at magnet schools, what often, and again, it depends upon geographic area, what happens is they tend to be schools within schools. The students, go to school together, insofar as that they go into the same building, but they're also often they're in separate programs. They don't intermingle, so to speak, unless it's on football, sports teams, extracurricular activities. They may sit together in lunch, but they have no interaction in the true sense that is required by a democratic society to meet the robust nature of a democratic society. They're not exchanged necessarily by virtue of school exchanging perspectives over materially consequential matters. The argument runs. Well, Kozol writes this: the magnet system is, not surprisingly, highly attractive to the more sophisticated parents, disproportionately white and middle class, who have the ingenuity and now and then political connections to obtain admission for their children. It is also viewed by some of its defenders as an ideal way to hold white people in the public schools by offering them choices that resemble what they'd find in private education. Children who have had the benefits of preschool and one of the better elementary schools are a great advantage in achieving entrance to selective high schools. But an even more important factor seems to be the social class and education level of their parents. This is the case because the system rests on the initiative of parents. The poorest parents, often the products of inferior education, sometimes lack the information access and the skills of navigation in an often hostile and intimidating situation to channel their children to the better schools, obtain the application, and perhaps a little more importantly, help them get ready for the necessary tests and then persuade their elementary schools to recommend them. So even in poor black neighborhoods, for instance, it tends to be children of the less poor and the better educated who are likely to break through the obstacles and win admission. The system has the surface aspects of a meritocracy, but merit in this case is predetermined by conditions that are closely tied to class and race. While some defend it as, in theory, the survival of the fittest, it is more accurate to call it the survival of the children of the fittest, or of the most favored. So that's the magnet. Again, Kozol would say that a magnet option is good insofar as it goes, particularly insofar as it allows individuals to escape physically, spiritually, or emotionally, mentally, cognitively harmful situations. But it in no way addresses the fundamental root problem facing American public schooling. And if you simply look at, Orange County has a magnet system back in the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006, something like that. Orange County stopped busing magnet school kids. Well, the numbers fell off. Simply transportation issue. So it has its problems. Magnet option has its problems as a remedy for the problems that he's addressing in his text. But it appears, it's much like No Child Left Behind, it appears to the public that it's open for all, and then that it's addressing the fundamental problems related to class, race, inequality, and inequity, when it's not. It gives the sense that, look, and you'll see this more when we get to vouchers in just a second. It gives the public the sense that, look, it's open to all, and if parents, open to all parents and all children, if they don't exercise their magnet option, in the case of vouchers, their voucher option, only 1% of the millions of children who qualify for voucher, the voucher option, the choice plan, exercise 1%. Exercise, as Kozol points it out in The Shame of the Nation, he gives you the numbers. Exercise that option, then it's the parent's fault. Is what the assumption is, or the assumption is the parents must not have the wherewithal, the intelligence, the want to improve their children's situation. So it's fair. It's the situation's fair. You got options, you're just not exercising. Who's to blame but yourself? Kozol will say these types of programs then work to justify the persistence of inequality. And of course, the voucher issue, the vouchers. Boy, it's easy to get real technical on defining vouchers, but you know what that is. Look, if the claim is that compulsory attendance laws require children to go to unequal schools, then just provide that what's allowed per pupil spending in the form of a coupon or voucher, and allow that child to use it at a school in district or participating inter districts to transfer schools to a better situation. Let's see, Milwaukee, DC. Three, I'm screwing this, Cleveland, and then New Orleans. But New Orleans is a whole different animal. I mean, after Katrina, they turned Louisiana and the city of New Orleans turned a lot of its public schools into charters, and it has just leave that out of the equation. But and many states have what they call voucher programs or scholarship. But the true vouchers are the Milwaukee Parental Choice Plan. Or program, the DC schools, I forget the name of the nature of that, and then the Cleveland choice or voucher system. Milwaukee was the first. Wisconsin and the city of Milwaukee was the first to employ the voucher program in the 1990s. Polly Williams, who was a state legislator for Wisconsin, argued on the House of the floor, the legislative chamber, that look, it's kind of like she used the metaphor of a used car salesman. If you sell used cars and you sell nothing but lemons, no one's going to buy your cars. It's going to force you, if you want to stay in business and continue selling cars, your product you have to sell better cars. Well, the same logic applies to schools. If we allow students to shop around, so to speak, to the better schools, it'll force schools to get better, or we'll close them down. So you introduce a dose of competition. You've heard this before. And Polly Williams was very concerned. She represented inner city Milwaukee, and some of the schools that Kozol points out in his text, the characteristics of poor schools was fitting to inner city Milwaukee schools, riddled, particularly high schools, riddled with violence, poverty, and underperforming in terms of the standards that the state set and so forth. But the part of the choice program, students had to be 200, 300% of the poverty line. And now you can look these figures up now. I don't know what that is. There's gradation. You simply put Milwaukee Parental Choice Program voucher, you may come up with qualifications. You'll come up with the 2017-2018 qualifications, and you see the chart. Family of one, I think it's $35,000 and under. Or family of one, that is family with one child, and on down, and so forth. So students had to be a certain percentage of the poverty line. They could take the voucher. I think the initial voucher was, God, I want to say $4,000 in 1990. Now it's $7,000 and something dollars per student. They could take that voucher, and they've expanded it to the number of schools, and I think even to religious founded schools to participate. You just simply Google it, you'll find it. But the choice schools that received students or received the voucher had to meet at least one of four criteria. And I forget the guy's name. It'll come to me after I do this video. I can't remember his name now. I'm sorry. He was a political scientist at University of Wisconsin Stout. It doesn't matter what his name is now. He was charged with doing the annual review of the program for 4 straight years. I'll get to that in a second. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead and losing my train of thought. They had to meet one of 4 criteria, the receiving school. At least 70% of the pupils in the program had to advance 1 grade level each year. Average attendance had to be at least 90%. 3. At least 80% of the students had to demonstrate significant academic progress, whatever significant academic progress means. That was really a catch-all. And at least 70% of students' families had to meet parental involvement criteria. What is his name? Paul? Yeah. It'll come to me. I'm so sorry. But what the annual reviews pointed out is that well over half of the students who started the program each year dropped out. I mean, 60-something% dropped out of the program, went back to their original schools, the schools from which they came. Now, why? And I'll get at why in a second. Attendance rates for those who remained was still met the 90%, met the criteria. 70% of the students in the program did advance 1 grade level in mathematics or reading. I'm screwing this up. And this has been true in other places. I think they improved 1 grade level, if not 2 grade levels, in mathematics, but not in reading. There is, I mean, if you simply go to the review or annual review of the DC program, you'll see that such students who exercise, voucher students, they will, their academic performance as measured by standardized test scores will spike, and then they'll plateau. And you will see that one of the areas, either reading or math, and again, easy to find, they will show more gains in one or the other, and then those scores start to plateau. At least 80% of the students had to demonstrate significant academic progress. The evidence, at least in the initial run, was that it did not. They did not, however significant academic progress was, however it was defined. But most schools or receiving schools met the last criteria. That is, 70% of students' families had to meet parental involvement criteria. Parents loved the program, particularly if you're looking at Milwaukee, African American parents who felt and still feel that their students, their children are in better, safer environments than the schools for which they were zoned, and they certainly are involved in the operations of the school. They meet parental involvement criteria. Now, God, what is his name? Why did most of the students, or over 60% of the students, drop out? Well, number one on the list is transportation, after school care, and then food. And I've never quite, I guess, access to food and so forth. Those are the reasons. There are reasons why kids can't. I mean, there are socioeconomic reasons why kids can't exercise their voucher issues or their voucher options. So that it's open to all, and that there are no constraints on it, on exercising their voucher option, is contrary to fact. Now, again, Kozol would argue the same thing with the voucher that he does, the voucher problem as he does with the problems with magnet schools. Are good insofar as they go, but they often appear to the public as if these plans enable parents to get their kids out of a bad situation. If they don't, the parents are the only ones to blame. There's the business fix. What do I do with that? Good gracious, the business fix. The third prevailing option, and I want to call this the vocational approach, and there is a degree of truth to it, but it operates only on certain assumptions that I think need to be exposed, and that's certainly what Kozol wants to expose. The CEO of Citibank, a former CEO of Citibank, once says, "Look, let's be realistic. No one expects these ghetto kids to go to college. Most of them are lucky if they're even literate. If we teach them some useful skills, get them to stay in school and graduate, and maybe into jobs, we're giving them the most they can hope for." Money is not the difference. That's what they argue. They will not be able to make use of the most esoteric curricular offerings. I mean, what are these kids going to use? I've heard one business executive say, "What are these kids going to do with analytic geometry? Quantum mechanics." You can give it to them. We can spend good money after good money to provide the curricular opportunities, but the vast majority of them, if there's going to be one, is going to make use of it. The best that we can do, as another. What was it? The governor of Illinois, Jim Thompson, once said, "You don't rearrange the chair." The problem with people in East St. Louis, you don't continue. Money is not the difference. You don't continue to pour money down a black hole, he said. You don't rearrange the chairs on the Titanic, he said. Money is not the issue. Well, the best that we can do is provide a viable economic skill such that the children or students have a marketable skill that will be able to make their way in the world economically, and thus will not be a strain on society. Wow, I screw up every piece of clothing I have with coffee. And Kozol, a couple things about this. Kozol argues that, look, providing students who, by all indications, do not have vocational skill or any skill and have not developed adequate skills for college, academic skills. Provide them with some set of skills, whether it be academic or vocational, is a good thing in itself. There's no doubt about it. But by virtue, as Kozol puts it, by virtue of of limiting or narrowing or affecting the quality of their elementary school experience, the middle school experience, we have a diminished product, and then we turn around and say, let's be realistic and do what we can with them. There's something immoral about that. We limit their experience such that they don't have the academic choice, and then we turn around and say, well, let's do what we can with them. So, a couple last observations. John Coons was a professor at the University of UCLA or UC Berkeley. Said, "Look, there's something immoral about all this. You do not force a losing baseball team. I mean, in terms of money. Look, money may not make all the difference, but that doesn't mean we don't have a moral obligation to try." You don't, as he put it, you don't force a losing baseball team to play with 7 players. Why would we deprive students who obviously need money? Equity in this case would mean that students as impoverished as some of the students that Kozol's getting at would suggest that they need even more money than the rest of the schools to meet the particular needs that they have. But there are those who, a colleague of mine here at the University of Central Florida, while he was at another institution, and he's no longer here now, but he said East St. Louis attempted to improve the physical the schools. Some of the schools I once interviewed. I was interviewing for a job at Southern Illinois at Edwardsville, and one of the job assignment was to provide professional development in the schools in East St. Louis. I went into a elementary school that had 4 classes in a gymnasium that was basically falling in. There was a hole in the side, in the roof and the side where it was crumbling. It had crumbled. They'd cleaned all that out, and they were literally heating that gymnasium with lit 55-gallon barrels. They had pallets. They were burning supposedly untreated pallets, but the way that color was burning, man, it looked like it was treated pallet. So East St. Louis the state of Illinois and East St. Louis attempted to rectify this situation. They knocked some of the schools down. They repaired some of the schools, made some of the schools state of the art. The colleague I had here was on the academic team that went in to review it to see if that change in environment made a difference in student performance. It did not. Well, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It's not going to happen overnight either. Okay. The next, usually in a face-to-face course, I spend the time dealing with social class, because ultimately, we can't. The executives who argue for vocational education and proponents of vocational education come from the spectrum. There are plenty of academics who advocate vocational education to fix this issue, or to resolve this issue, or to address this issue. But it's typical that those who say no one expects these ghetto kids to go to college operate on the old saying, or at least assume that you can take the child out of the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of the child, so to speak. And what they're getting at there, and there's some look, and what they're getting at is that, look, social class schools can only do so much. They can address social class, and social class does have an impact on students materially and cognitively, mentally, in terms of perspective, in terms of worldview. And there is a connection. You've heard that poverty is a cycle. Well, the mechanism works the same in every social class. I mean, if there's any one strong suit of mine outside of philosophy, it's sociology and sociology of social class. I'm a student of social class. I grew up to mill people of classes. Look, I'm a white dude. I'm privileged by being white in a racist society, and a male. The only thing that I had going against me was growing up to what was pejoratively, to people who were called lint heads. Now, we took that as a badge of honor, but I grew up to poor people, and so social class has always been a blessing and a demon of mine, and a curse of mine. And so I've been a student of social class all my entire life, and as an academic, and of course people spend, and we could spend, I'm not doing justice to class in this course. I can't. And in fact, I'm not even giving it a day or any analysis. There's no point to it. It's a waste of time in some ways, because we can't. By giving it a brief analysis, I run a greater risk of reinforcing stereotypes that I don't want to be reinforced. But like the mechanism by which class reproduces itself the same. Objective circumstances, and this comes out of Max Weber's definition of class, socioeconomic class. The objective circumstances, the stuff of a person's life, will create certain worldviews, ways of seeing the world. And when those worldviews, which includes beliefs, ideals, patterns of behavior, and so forth, are put into action, they tend to recreate the very circumstances that created the worldview to begin with. Thus, you have a mutually reinforcing relationship between objective circumstances, worldview, and thus the mechanism, the cycle, operates in every social class. Every social class there is. A couple of really good books, sociological classics, ethnographic classics, and classics in the study of social class. J. McLeod's Ain't No Making It. J. McLeod's Ain't No Making It. Sorry, that's a tattered copy. Lillian Rubin's Worlds of Pain. Don't have it. Oh, here's another copy of Ain't No Making It. J. McLeod. Paul Willis's Learning to Labor. I don't have that here. I'd show you the cover of that too. Just be consistent. Learning to Labor are good analyses of social class and education's and schooling's place in reinforcing that mechanism. But look, so when people make the argument that you can take the child out of the ghetto, you can't take the ghetto out of the child, what they're getting at is the issue of class. And class, even for those of us who are very sympathetic with Kozol's concerns, and who see schools as can be a transformative experience to improve the life chances of children, have to deal with this issue of class. Now, just one last, God, I don't have it, I'm sure I don't have it here, and somebody be fishing for it. Jim Coleman, just quickly, 1964, as part of Johnson's war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, Johnson made the claim that, look, 1964 civil rights legislation took care of racism. Yeah, right. Look at us in 2017, for crying out loud. But we've legislated against racism as an obstacle to a truly democratic society. The last obstacle to a truly democratic society is socioeconomic class poverty. So Johnson charged U.S. Congress with finding out what our public institutions do to reinforce poverty, and what our public institutions can do to fix this issue of poverty. In terms of education, the U.S. Congress commissioned James Coleman. We simply call it the Coleman Report as an official name, and if I could stop this and look for my material, I would I would use that for a second, or I would employ that material for a second. I'll do it in the next video for next week. But just the gist of it, if you simply look up the Coleman Report related to education, you'll find these figures yourself. Coleman had 2 years funded by the U.S. Congress for over a 2-year period, and conducted the biggest, most massive social scientific piece of research still probably. He interviewed, I think, over 600,000 students, 60,000 teachers, and roughly 4,000 schools across the country. He interviewed them, gave them a battery of tests, so on and so on. Wrote up his findings under subheadings, and I'll read this next time. Coleman maintained that basically schools can do very little, if nothing at all, to improve the life chances of students. The biggest influencer of students' academic performance is the socioeconomic status from which that child comes. Now, this sent teachers into a tailspin. It implies that they do not matter in this process. And teachers anecdotally knew and hoped knew that they mattered in children's lives, that they made a difference in the life chances, that is, the opportunities that one will face over the course of one's life, in people's lives. And so that sent off a host of research. Christopher Jinks, for instance, who couldn't accept Coleman's findings, replicated his study, and in a book simply titled Inequality, Christopher Jinks, Jenks, Christopher Jinks. I think it was published in 72, 73, something like that. Who was very skeptical of Coleman and Coleman's findings. His basic finding was that anything short of a redistribution of wealth in this society will not improve children's resources. That sent off a host of research, was the context out of which a ton of research on socioeconomic class and education transpired or developed. And so socioeconomic class is something that we have to account for. That's, if you have any interest in the effects of socioeconomic class in education and are pursuing a master's or a graduate degree, or if you simply are an undergraduate and you want to engage in this issue, just come and see me or notify me, and we can go on back and forth on this matter. Y'all take care.